All right, well, let's get started and we can have people kind of hop on when they get a chance. So again, I want to thank everybody for joining us for Bluegreen's first webinar, which you know is called Unlock Your Uniques in 1 hour. I'll introduce us in just a second, but just know that even though it's our first webinar, my background as a professor at the University of Illinois means I've done a lot of these types of formats, but it's my first time in my role as Bluegreen's creative strategist doing this. So again, welcome. Hope that you were attracted to this because you saw something in there where you thought, oh, I would love to be able to do that at my own company. And we want to make sure we get you the most value possible. Hopefully everybody can hear my voice and see my screen. I also want to just quickly introduce both myself and my partner, Charlene. So the two of us founded Bluegreen Branding earlier this year, although we worked together for something around 9 years at this point at different companies and also consulting together. Bluegreen Branding, as you can imagine, is a branding and marketing agency. We specialize in helping companies bridge the gap between their business and their brand. I'll talk more about that at the end of this. But in our partnership, I play the role of creative strategist, which is very much the role that I'll be playing today. And Charlene is our integrator. We both have a background as entrepreneurs, business owners, and so together we find that we click pretty well with other business owners and other marketers. Today during our webinar, you'll hear my voice for the most part as I walk you through this exercise and this tool that we've developed. Also, Charlene is helping me with audience participation. If you have a question along the way or a comment, please use the chat feature to throw that question out there. And I will address it when I see it. Charlene's going to help me by both welcoming people, as you've seen, and also by making sure that I catch a question in case I'm talking and I miss it. There's also, I do just want to say that I don't want to just hear my own voice this entire time, so I do encourage questions and comments along the way. We have time carved out near the end for Q&A if we have time, which we should, but please don't feel like you have to wait until the very end to ask questions. Please feel free to dive in at any time. So I want to just kind of start off. You may have seen this cartoon if you've seen us promoting this through LinkedIn or through email, but just talk about where this webinar came from. Many of you may be familiar with EOS, or the Entrepreneurial Operating System. If you're not familiar with it, we strongly encourage you to check it out. Just so you know, we're not officially affiliated with EOS worldwide, but we are big fans of it. We use it for our own company. We hold L10 meetings every week. And also Charlene has a background as an integrator at previous companies before this one. So we do speak that language. And EOS is a system for both businesses and entrepreneurs, something to help your company run in a very focused, organized sort of way so that it can grow. That really speaks to us because strategy, which is our world, is all about focus. But we've noticed a need out there. We've seen companies that run on EOS, and even those that don't, just general, especially business-to-business companies and other companies as well, tend to sometimes have a bit of a gap when it comes to knowing what to focus on. What are those key messages that we really want to talk about? What are those differentiators? How do we make sure that we stand out from other companies? In EOS language, these are your uniques. You know, what are your 3 uniques that define you and help you stand out in ways like nobody else? And we saw this gap because we were seeing companies fill out their 3 uniques or communicate to us what their 3 uniques are or differentiators. And they tended to honestly not be that unique. You know, to that particular company, it has a lot of meaning. It's like, oh, well, you know what, we care about our customers. We have a strong attention to detail. We believe in quality. You know, things that have a lot of meaning to them. But for Charlene and I, and those of us who have worked with lots of companies, we see those same things over and over again. And we realize, you know, there's really not a tool out there that is great for defining those uniques. EOS has a lot of great tools, but when it comes to this part, you know, they kind of simplify it a bit. They're sort of like, well, you know, be in a room together with your leadership team, talk about it for a little while, you know, maybe an hour-long conversation, and then you'll figure out what your 3 uniques are. Honestly, I don't think it's quite that simple. I've seen other tools out there. My background is in first as a copywriter and a creative in advertising and marketing agencies, later on as a brand strategist, and now as a professor at the University of Illinois. You know, there are lots of tools that are out there, but, you know, things like a SWOT analysis, for example. By the way, I'm not a huge fan of a SWOT analysis. It has its purposes. It's a little bit too easy to kind of phone it in with a SWOT. And so I found a need out there for some sort of a tool that can help people define what are those unique differentiators. And that's where this came into being. There's a tool that I developed that is the focus of this particular webinar. Developed it about, I'd say maybe 7 or so years ago. It actually came out of a client engagement, trying to shape a workshop, and thought, you know what, no existing tool really works. Let me give this a shot. And it worked really well. Since then, had refined it, used it with about a dozen different companies at several different agencies that I've worked at, very successfully. Usually involves, maybe an hour, 2-hour long workshop to kind of guide through it. So what I'm going to do is share with you what this tool is and how to use it, and then also guide you through the process of doing it yourself and deriving actual insights out of it that you can use. Sound good? Please also know that we're going to make this document available on our website after the fact, and we're also recording this video. We're going to find a way to share that with you guys as well. So if you see something on here and you don't quite capture it in the moment, know that we're going to make it available afterwards. So here is the bare bones of the tool. And again, going to guide you through how this actually works. So this is called a 3x3 message map. You can imagine that for starters, it's a very simple thing to create. You draw a 3x3 grid. I've used this before virtually, like you're going to see me do today, through Zoom or some other video format like that. You'll also, usually what happens is people do this in a room together with their leadership team. They have a conference room, they maybe have a cork board or a whiteboard up there. I'll even show you a photo of one after it's been completed. We use sort of twine to create this grid. You want to make it big enough though that you can actually populate it with little messages, sometimes post-it notes or index cards, and then stick it up there, move things around. So you start as simple as doing something like this. Now, what is the actual grid? As you know, a grid has to do with axes. So you're defining this grid on 2 different criteria. The x-axis, left to right, is gauging how much your target audience cares. We are going to ultimately plot different key messages, which are usually features and benefits. But one of the main criteria that we use is how much does our target audience cares? In order to understand this, you have to first define who your target audience is. Most of you who work at a business have multiple target audiences. Sometimes you have a real key audience you're focused on and then some secondary audiences. Sometimes you also take a look at things like your internal audiences. It's totally fine to have multiple audiences, but you're doing this with your primary target audience in mind. Now, where you plot things on this map matters a lot. If you're plotting something further to the right, that suggests that your audience cares a lot about this particular point. If you are plotting something further to the left, that suggests that it really doesn't matter that much to them. Again, we're not focused on what we wish they want. We're talking about what they actually want. So it helps to understand who your audience is and what they care about. And if you're plotting it somewhere horizontally in the middle, that suggests, it's somewhat moderate. They care about it somewhat. It's not the most important thing in the world to them, but it does matter. We're talking about your company, your product offerings. On the x-axis, we are going to take a look at on the y-axis, we're going to take a look at how good you are, your company, your offerings, how good you are relative to your competition. This is very important because no brand exists in a vacuum. You exist out there with competitors, both direct and indirect. Some companies are actually branching out into new territories and therefore are coming up against new competitors. But this is a relative thing. How good is your brand delivering on this particular point compared to everybody else out there? If you're plotting it further to the top, that means that on that particular point, you're the best in the industry or you're unique. You are the only one offering something like this. So that's a position of strength. If you're taking a particular point and you're not that good at it, in fact, maybe you're even bad at it compared to some of your competitors, you're plotting it near the bottom. And if it's something that you're somewhat good at, maybe it's at parity, hey, we're pretty good at it, but so are a lot of other people, a lot of other companies, you're plotting it near the middle. So again, I'm going to show you how we plot these different points, but just keep these 2 particular axes in mind. It's very, very important once we start plotting these things, you're going to see how important it is to be honest with yourself. It does not help anybody if you're like, we're the best at this, we're the best at this, we're the best at that. I've worked with many clients who begin with, we're the absolute best. And remember, this is not a marketing exercise yet. This is all about being true to your brand and your company and what it is that you're good at, what your audience really cares about. Now, next you'll see here I've started to plot little things that say feature, benefit, in some cases value. I'll actually show you on the next slide. I'll walk you through what this actually looks like when you do this for real. But what you do is you write out a bunch of one-off points. They are typically a benefit, like what is something that our target audience gets out of our offerings, or a feature, what's a particular product or proof point or something that we have, something that is going to be resonating with them, hopefully something that you're particularly good at. Then you've got, as you start to plot these things, you follow those same criteria that I just showed you earlier on. Now, again, you've got to be really honest and critical. The best way that these exercises go down is if you have a team of people together who represent different areas of the business. I've had times when I've been on the consulting side and I am I'm the strategist guiding a team. We might have an executive team that involves perhaps the president or CEO, somebody that represents marketing, somebody that represents sales, maybe somebody that represents product or R&D. Because you'll find that people actually have differing opinions on things. Sometimes you'll have the research and development person or the product person say, yes, we are the absolute best at this. And then the marketing person says, yeah, but our audience doesn't really care about it. So sometimes you need different people's perspectives to know where to plot these things. Just so you know, on an individual point, and again, I'll show you an example. Let's say there's a particular product feature or benefit that you have. Like, we are really good at delivering fast, compared to our competitors. You may have a rich conversation around that particular point. You may have people say something like, are we really that fast? I think that we have some competitors out there that are faster than we are. Somebody else may say, you know what, I think this is actually more important than we are giving people credit for. So we should actually take an honest look at what that is. I see here that there's this great question from John Cook. Are you plotting pain points, product features, benefits, or all of the above? You're typically plotting product features and benefits, sometimes also company offerings like services and things like that. You'll find out, though, I'll show you where you plot it tends to end up resulting in, is this a benefit, is this good for us, or is this a possible pain point? Now, just so you know, you don't need to have consensus. You don't have to be unanimous on where something is. You sometimes actually find a situation where it's impossible to land on something that everybody agrees on. So you at least need alignment. The exact location of something is not as important as, do we have a general idea of what zone we're in? Is this something that's very important to our audience or just moderately important? And sometimes on a particular point, you may even discuss things for 10, 15 minutes. Other times you have a point that gets plotted in 5 seconds and you move along. You'll see that as you do these things, I find that it helps to pre-populate some cards when you begin this exercise. If you're doing this in your conference room, say with corkboard, you might have actually written out on a series of 20 index cards, 1 point per thing. Other times, you may find that you're populating it as you go. You'll see on the next slide, I've pre-populated some to make things go faster, but you should feel like you're comfortable adding things, removing things, rewriting things, consolidated. Now, as you are doing things, you may actually find that certain things cluster together. There's maybe a handful of different points that are very closely related. So sometimes you consolidate them. Other times you may find that you have to split something apart. You have a point like quality. Okay, what does quality actually mean? Let's get more specific. You may actually split it into 2 different points. Sometimes you'll find things along the way. You're like, these 3 different things are just saying the same things in 3 different ways. How do we actually, do we really need to say all of them? Let's pick our favorite one. Let's maybe pick an umbrella statement that speaks to all of those. And this is just an important note. We'll revisit it later on, but you may find that for a particular point, it varies greatly based on your target audience. You may find that your primary target audience cares about something a great deal, but in other cases, you find that this audience cares a lot, this one doesn't. In that case, you may plot a point twice, maybe color code it per audience. You may actually find that you have to create a completely new grid for a different target audience. So we'll show what that looks like. I see there's a question here from Kevin. How differentiated value versus benefit? That's a great question. I used to never plot values. Benefits are the most important thing to plot on these. Benefits, difference between features and benefits being a feature is a quality or an aspect of something that you deliver. A benefit is what does your audience get out of it? For example, our feature is that we have this particular screen size for our device. You can measure it in inches. A benefit is, they get a better viewing experience for particular things. So it's a very important thing to include both. Values are one of those things that honestly, values are more important to your company culture. Sometimes values become an external facing thing, much more now than in the past. I find that for values, it's less important that they're differentiated from other companies. That it's more important that you actually live up to them. However, if you plan on making values a big part of your messaging, it is worth plotting things like that. Charlene and I sometimes laugh though, because there are situations where people have values that are completely table stakes, like honesty, for example. And we're like, well, a company's never going to say we lie. So it's great if you have honesty or integrity as a value of yours. You know, you may challenge yourself to get more specific, but you don't have to feel like you have to get more differentiated in that. Just don't make it a big part of your messaging. So let me show you what this looks like. One reason that I'm not showing this on full screen mode is so that you can actually see, we can actually adapt this in real time. So what you're looking at here is a 3x3 grid that I've created here in this keynote presentation deck. You'll see that I've plotted the lines. You'll see that I have these axes noticed over here. Audience cares little, audience cares a lot on the top left, top right. And you've got relative strengths at the top, relative weaknesses at the bottom. I think I see that there is a question. Does somebody want to hop in with audio, or would you like to add it to the chat? Well, if you have a question, I saw that there was a hand raised briefly, but feel free to jump into the chat, or there's the Q&A feature up at the top left. I'll try to answer these as we go. So anyway, you'll see here that we've got different items on here, and I put this in a way that you can move these around. I sometimes, when I pre-populate these on the screen, I like to put them in the bottom left corner. You'll find the bottom left corner is like, if something actually got plotted in the bottom left corner, it would mean that you're bad at it and your audience doesn't care. So typically those messages don't really come into play. I have here fairly generic statements here. I would encourage you, if you're doing this yourself, to get more specific than this, but just to illustrate the point and to make sure that this applies to many different audiences, I would want to make sure that you actually get specific on it. So something like customer service. This is a feature. This is an offering. This is something that you might be particularly good at, maybe not. You maybe have more specific ways that you could break this down. But many companies, depending on what you do, may have some version of this, right? We treat our customers well. We are very responsive to them. We give them what they need. If you were to do this exercise, you would actually put this card in front of the crowd and say, okay, how good are we for real at customer service compared to other competitors in our space? If you take a look at the airline industry, United Airlines does not have a reputation for customer service like Southwest Airlines does. And so Southwest Airlines not only would talk about it a lot, they would make sure that they actually deliver on that. Somebody that has terrible customer service may feel like they need to actually do something better about it before they start talking about it. So you would have a conversation with your team. People are like, you know what? I think that we're pretty good at customer service, but I think we're about as good as some others that are out there. We're not the best, we're not the worst. However, in our particular space, we find that customer service is something that's very important to our audience. So again, vertically, are we good? Are we not? We're average, so it's somewhere in the middle. Horizontally, does our audience care? Do they not? We've defined that they really do care. So you'll see that it gets plotted in this right middle. You might have something like, speed of delivery. I used this one earlier on. Again, you might be in manufacturing, you might be in retail, you might be in business-to-business consulting. Speed of delivery might be an important element. And this might be something where people are like, yes, our audience, they care about it quite a bit, and we're okay at it. Our audience, it's not the most important thing to them, but it doesn't matter. We are not the best at it. We're not the worst at it. We're pretty good. So you might decide, okay, based on that, we're pretty good in both of these areas. It lands somewhere like here. Then you might have a situation like customizability. This is a good example of one. We can really create custom solutions to our target audience. In what regard is this something that matters? So customizability, we might say, okay, you know what? We've actually done some research. We've heard from our customers. Customizability is very, very important to them. And it turns out that out of everybody in our space, that's actually one of the things that we do the best. We are more customizable or do a better job customizing than anybody else out there. And so we may decide to go ahead and include that in there. So that suggests that it's in the upper right quadrant. We're both very good at it and our audience really cares. Here's one, quality materials. This comes in quite a bit in places that I work with. Companies will talk about it could be anything from like food, like Papa John's, we have the best ingredients, to something that's very, a high touch manufacturing kind of a thing. We use this particular form of titanium to make sure that it's, 20% lighter weight while 30% stronger, things like that. This is a good example of something that like we might be the best at it. Our audience doesn't necessarily care that much. They appreciate in general the idea that like what you put into something is what you get out of it, but that's not usually why they buy things. It's kind of like, oh, that's good to know. But maybe you feel that you actually do have the best. Maybe, hopefully, you've got a way to actually either validate this, and again, you're honest with yourself that you're not just saying you're the best, but you actually are. But let's say we're really good, so vertically, it goes near the top, and our audience kind of cares, kind of not. So horizontally, it ends up in this top middle. Let me show you a few examples of ones that, from my experience, that have sometimes not gone well. Made in the United States. So I worked with a tailored clothing brand. It was men's tailored suits, an old brand that's actually a great brand out there. They were made in the United States, and they were one of the very few brands in fashion that were. They were very proud of this. This is a major part of their heritage. This was a big recruiting thing for them. However, we did some research, and we learned that people, as men, when they're buying suits and tailored clothing, they don't really care where it's made. They care about a lot of other things, the way it looks, the cost, the way it fits, things like that. But instead of like actually honestly taking a look at that, they decided to tout that all the time, even though it didn't matter that much. So what ended up happening was they are very unique. They were made in the United States when most others were not. However, we learned from research that our audience doesn't really care about that. Now, I'll talk about later on why it's dangerous to put things in the upper left corner, but that's honestly where it landed. I see that there was a question about how do we know what a customer values? This is a great question. In order to do this effectively, you have to have a pretty good bead on what your target audience cares about. Research is one part of this. Research can involve talking to your current customers, maybe even doing broader market research on people that fit in your target audience. You don't want to just be guessing. So it is dangerous to go into this exercise just making assumptions. But hopefully your company has done some of this in the past. Sometimes you do this exercise first, and then you do research to validate, are we right? Do they really care about this, or do they not? Hopefully somebody that's in the room when you're doing this is somebody that has a pretty good bead on what your target audience cares about. Here's now for this tailored clothing brand. This is interesting, and I'll talk about how this relates. This tailored clothing brand, while they found that they were unique about being made in the United States, but people didn't really care. It turns out that they were also, our same research found that their clothing fits really well, meaning like it's tailored in a way that it actually fits the wearer particularly well relative to competitors. This is actually a real thing. And we learned that our target audience really cares about that. We learned that actually when it comes to attractiveness of clothing, the most important thing is the fit, even more than say the patterns, the styles, the materials, everything else like that. Now, fit, again, they're really good at it, and our audience really cares about it. It was the type of thing that ended up in the upper right corner. Just so you know, though, this was a bit of a battle with the client. They said, yeah, we hear that our fit is good and that people care. However, we want to continue talking about in our marketing, we want to tout primarily that we're made in the United States and that we're made with quality materials. And we're telling them, look, strategically, that is not a great way to go. You are focusing on things, yes, that you should be proud of and that you're doing well, but your audience doesn't care. And they said, well, we should invest in making them care. We should make our campaign entirely educational to make people appreciate that more. And we said, that's a respectable thing to do. But if what you want to do is be successful with your marketing, see some ROI, we should focus on fit, because this is something your audience already cares about. Everything else is this uphill battle. And maybe over time we can teach them these things, but use this as a way to decide where do we want to focus our marketing. Other things in here, an example of something that often ends up in a different place, price. Now, price matters in almost every industry. Now, more in some cases than others. There's also different ways to define price, but price almost always is going to end up being some sort of a criteria. Price is something that people sometimes, they put them in the upper right if they're like, well, we're really expensive and our audience cares. Well, you don't want to put it in the upper right if you're expensive. This is a little counterintuitive, but you want to put it in the bottom right. If your audience really cares about this in your space, which typically they do, and it's something that you have as a weakness, usually being expensive is a weakness, it means it's in the bottom. So even though your price might be high, that makes it a negative. So if you have any questions on that, let me know. Price is one of those things. If you are a premium brand, if you're one of the more expensive brands in your category, price is often one of those things that ends up in the bottom right. I'll talk later on about what happens when things get placed in different areas. But that means that we have to address this at some point. It's probably not part of our core marketing, but we do probably need to somehow address this. I've seen companies reword things, and I'll talk about this later on too. Sometimes you can reposition price. For example, if you position it as long-term value, hey, we're more expensive, but it lasts longer, so it's cheaper over time, then write that up. Feel free to type these things out. You know, if you called it long-term value instead of price, all of a sudden it's no longer something that appears in the bottom right. It might be something that you can move up a little bit. Okay, long-term value, we're good on that. Our audience, you know, maybe still needs to be educated on that a bit, but that's how you move things, not by being dishonest with yourself, but by saying, is there a way we can position this to make it more valuable? So I'm not going to plot all these points, but you can see how this works. A room full of people, actually, Charlene and I just went through this exercise with a client about a week ago, and it was a very complex client with a team of about a dozen people working virtually on this. And it took us about, I'd say, an hour and a half of this plotting to kind of get some good conclusions. So it may take a while, especially since sometimes you'll have a specific point that, you know, people talk about for a long time. Sometimes people go off on tangents. Sometimes they come back to it. Eco-friendly, by the way, I just wanted to include this again. This is another one of those like customer service where it's like, well, our audience really cares about it. We're fine at it. We're not the best. We're not the worst. In some industries, this doesn't matter at all, or it's not even relevant. In other industries, this is the most important things. It may really matter. But these are, you know, different ways that you plot these. Now, I just want to show you kind of a quick visual here. This is a photo from an exercise doing this years ago with a client, just so you can see what this kind of looks like if you do it in person. We did this on a board. We had a big wall at our agency that had a cork board. And so what we did was we used thread and pins to kind of create the grid. We had relevant information nearby so that we could reference it at a moment's notice. We did this with the client. I think there were something like 8 of them from representing different areas of the business, trying to all kind of weigh in different ways. And we had these Post-it notes that were pre-populated, but then we also had some, you know, some blanks handy so that we could add more as necessary. And we really did spend time with each of these things. It's always interesting to see, again, what a product development person says about a particular point compared to, say, a marketing person. Sometimes you may even have the CEO be completely unaware that there's something that's an issue. Kevin, I see that you have another question. You want to throw it in the Q&A, or would you like to jump in? All right, I'll keep an eye on that Q&A space. So yeah, just wanted to show you what this looks like when it's actually implemented. Now, why do we do all this? We do this because we hope it guides us on knowing where to focus. The key to strategy is focus. What I found this both as a strategist and as a copywriter, that people want to say everything and they want to say it all at once. You know, they maybe have, this is when you end up with like an ad or a marketing piece or a website that has a list of messages. You know, your first paragraph is a list of 13 different things. An elevator pitch has a little bit of trouble getting focused on things. Kevin, I see this question, earlier model, so different criteria. I'm not sure exactly what that means. Maybe he'll clarify that in the question. I'm not sure if you were referencing this this earlier grid. It said features and benefits, priorities and needs. Same thing though. It's talking about how good are we with our features and benefits? How much does our customer care about this? Again, so we do this for strategy. Now, one of the most illuminating moments in these exercises is when you take a step back, you spent an hour and a half, and you are going to take a look at where things landed. So when you look at things where things landed, I like to say start by looking in the upper right. That's the area that I've indicated here in green. I call this jackpot because these are really valuable things. Any points that landed in the upper right corner are things you want to pay particularly close attention to. These are things that have the potential to be your uniques, or your key points of differentiation. If there's one main thing in the upper right, that could even be what's known as your promise or your value proposition. Like, not only is it one of your 3 uniques, but it is the main thing that you're going to talk about. And I'll talk about what you can do with that. Then you start to look outward from there. You take a look in this blue ring here. These make good support points. These are things that either we are pretty good at, but they're things that our audience really cares about, so we need to address it in some way. I call these table stakes. You guys are familiar with that term, I'm sure. It's like sometimes we have to say something about it. If we don't say anything about it, we are somehow, it's going to be noticeable that it's absent. So, however, we don't really have anything particularly unique to say about it. So let's put our best foot forward. We'll talk about what we do with that. Things that appear in that upper middle, I call this the educate quadrant. I'll talk more about that in a moment too. I'll talk about each of these quadrants in more detail and what you do with them. That means we're really, really good. Our audience just kind of cares. So what do we do about that? But things that appear in this blue zone, they make for good support points because maybe no one of them is so strong that it can become a key message. But they work well together, and even better if they can kind of ladder up to your jackpot, your key message up there. It can be potentially very valuable. And then you'll see that in these upper left and bottom right corners, these are called risk zones, or they're problem areas. I'll address that in a moment too. But these are things that you can't ignore because there's an issue going on right here that has to be addressed. Things that appear in the white area, white quadrants in the bottom left, those are usually things you can kind of ignore. These are things that, again, you're not very good at, your audience doesn't really care that much about it. It probably doesn't have to feature into what you're talking about very much. This is also a moment where you can start to take a look, can we move something based on, and certainly you should vet these things along the way to make sure you're being open and honest. But if we get more specific, if we rephrase this in a certain way, is that a way that maybe we can shift the location of something? Something that, again, if it was price, we're the most expensive one, it's in the risk zone. If we phrase it as long-term value, because we want people to think about cost over time, or sometimes it costs money, but it helps save you even more money for some reason, then you might find a way to move things around. So think about it. If there's a way you can honestly move things, you should certainly do that. And you use this as a way to start to identify next steps. And I have 5 different launching points in the following 5 slides of what you can do that. But what you want to do is take a look at these possible areas of next steps, talk about what you want to do about it, and then make sure that you have a person that owns it, because the last thing you want to do is have another one of those strategy sessions where you walk away with no clear owners or next steps. And then years later, people are like, hey, remember that thing we did that one time? Yeah, whatever came of that. I want to pause here for a moment just to make sure that I'm caught up on questions. Does anybody have any questions at this point, or anything that that I haven't addressed yet? Okay, so moving on to what we do about this. At Bluegreen, we call these strategy starters. I'm going to share 5 of them with you. Strategy starters are essentially actionable insights. They're ahas that you learned. Hey, there's something really interesting there. But very importantly, you can do something about it. There's clear next steps about what you can do. So here's the first one, taking a look at that upper right corner. Again, I just call it jackpot. You can call it whatever you like, opportunity zones, sometimes areas of potential, whatever you want to call it. But again, when you're taking a look at this, see what points got plotted in that upper right. First of all, give it an extra round of vetting, because things up there have a lot of potential and you could potentially build a lot of things off of it. But first you got to ask yourself, is this true? Is this really something that we're the best at and that we're unique at? Are we really picking our brains to think about our competitors and who else is out there that might offer something like this? Does our audience really care? Is it something that maybe, to that earlier question, we can actually do some research and validate it? Or is it something that maybe, we want them to care, but maybe they don't? And the reason you do that extra vetting is because there's a lot you can do with these. You don't want to spend a lot of time and money building something out of these if there's nothing there. Now, in that corner, is there a clear main message? Is there one main point in there that's like, yep, that's the one? We maybe don't have the wording down yet, but whenever we focus in this thing, we win. It's something that we're really good at, potentially unique at, and it's something that our audience really cares about. That's a potential area to win with. When I say it's a main message, that means that, on your website, that should be very clear on your homepage, like maybe even your headline is probably copywritten, can be phrased a little bit different, but the first thing that people see, the first vibe they get, it guides the visuals. In your marketing, if you're developing a marketing campaign, that would be the thing that appears on the creative brief that, all of your creative work builds off of, getting that one main message across. If you are developing a tagline, if you're in the process of branding, you want to create a slogan, usually that's the starting point. Again, it's not necessarily written that way yet, but it is something that is your launching off point. Thought leadership, building your thought leadership around this particular point can be very valuable. And ask yourselves, what more can we do to own this? Is this something where we can really build up how we have a proprietary thing around it? We can be known as the thing in the marketplace that is the one that delivers X. That is when you're starting to get into this could be your point of positioning. This is your key niche, your market niche that you're known for. Sometimes it even means coming up with a piece of intellectual property. Hey, is there a way now that we can coin this phrase, for example, or we can speak to the way that we do it that nobody else does. So it is worth spending a lot of time on this. This is an area that your company can potentially really start to win over customers. And that's a really valuable thing. Next zone, we have what I called earlier table stakes. This is the things that appear in the middle right. So table stakes means, as you know, everybody says this kind of a thing, but we feel like we kind of have to, right? So actually ask yourselves, do we have to say this? Is this something that if we didn't talk about it prominently, that it would be noticeable and it would be missed? In some cases, the answer is yes, we do have to talk about it. There's plenty of areas, again, if it's about customer experience where you're pretty good but not the best, if it's about in certain industries being eco-friendly where you're pretty good at it and you're not the best, you still probably have to address it. If you're an EOS and you have 3 uniques, do you want to use one of your uniques on something like this? That's a little bit tricky. It's rough using one of your key messages on something that's table stakes. So then think about, how does this fit into our main message? Is this a completely different point than our key message, our main message that appeared in the upper right? If it's related in some way, let's try to connect those dots so that it's not just a one-off throwaway, but rather it's something that supports a bigger message. Or is there a way we can speak to it that makes it more unique? That can involve either how we communicate it, like we phrase this in a way that's either more specific or more nuanced, in a way that we can move it up a little bit because we're a little bit better at it now, the way that we defined it. Or honestly, maybe it's not a messaging thing at all. Maybe it's just, hey, research and development, we need you guys to get on this a little bit. Can you work and make sure that the next rev is a little bit more unique, does actually deliver on this in a better way? Because the way we move things up in the messaging map is by getting better at those things. You know, you can't move, if you have customer service and stuck there in the middle, but your audience really cares, sometimes the only way to improve it is we just got to improve our customer service. We got to train people better. We need to have some better processes in place. And sometimes you end up with things that are table stakes where, you know, there may be 2 separate ones that separately are table stakes, but if somehow you were to combine them, this only works if they're actually related to each other. But if you're able to actually combine them, then you would actually be able to make them one thing that's unique. So, you know, for example, I worked with a brand that made home goods that were eco-friendly, and they were designed very well. They weren't the highest design goods, and they weren't the most eco-friendly, but they were the most eco-friendly, high design goods. And so by combining those 2 things, we took 2 table stakes and we turned it into, you know, one main message. Here's the third strategy starter, educate. So the things that appear in that top middle, these are the things that companies are really proud of, and they should be. They are things that they do uniquely. They are things that they do better than anyone else. The problem with them is that they're not yet something our audience really cares about. They're things that our audience kind of cares about. So the question there is, how do we make people care more? Sometimes making people care more is simply just about awareness. Like, people don't care because they don't know the difference between these 2 materials, or they don't care because they're not even aware that this is a criteria that goes into things. So sometimes just creating educational materials and building awareness around something is the way to do it. Sometimes making people care more is about persuasion. Now, this is a tougher nut to crack because it is hard to persuade an entire market to suddenly care more about a particular criteria. If you're a big player in the marketplace, you could potentially do it. Usually, though, it's more like if you're in a particular industry or you're in business to business, you're more counting on like your trade association to make people care more about those things. But there are ways to build these out. One way is by, again, seeing how does this connect to our main message. If our main message is something in that upper right corner, maybe it's something that's very benefit-oriented language. And this is very feature-oriented language that kind of supports it. Like the way we do it, the how is something up there that could potentially be very strong, sort of like a 1-2 punch. Sometimes you can shift things right over time with thought leadership. You build a thought leadership campaign and say, okay, over the course of months or even years, we are going to educate the public about what this particular area is and why it matters. Because again, this is an area where we win, but that's the only way we can shift things to the right, is to actually just make people care more. This is a good area. Lots of times features end up in this upper middle here. You know, our process is special, our materials are special, you know, things like that. Try to turn features into benefits whenever possible. Take a look at the feature. I worked with a strategist, their agency calls it the 5 whys, which I really like. They're like, take a feature and say, okay, why does our audience care about this? Why does that matter? You know, keep asking that why until you've transformed this feature into a phrase that's very benefit oriented. But again, it might be that you never fully make this a main message. It may always be a part 2, a support message for that key message that's up there in the upper right. And that's fine. Your features usually aren't your main message anyway. Here's the first of the risk zones I want to look at, the upper left. I call this risk zone, my mom says I'm special. This is the typical, we are great at this, we are unique at this, we are the best in the world, our audience just does not care. I'm just going to use that made in the USA example for that one particular brand. By the way, being made in the USA matters a lot for certain other categories, but for fashion, it turned out it just didn't matter. So this is a risk zone because companies are often inclined to pour lots of time and effort into promoting this because they're proud of it. In many cases, they should be proud of it. It doesn't necessarily mean, though, it should be one of your key messages that you're touting on all your marketing materials. You know, if you have an elevator pitch, do you want to waste any of your breath in those 20 seconds talking about something that just doesn't matter to people? So ask yourself, is there a way we can make this more relevant by, say, turning feature-oriented language into benefit-oriented language? Maybe this is more of an internal message. Maybe this is something that, you know, gets our employees really pumped up and may even actually help us recruit, but it doesn't help our customers. If that's the case, if you're finding that your employees care about very different things than your customers, and employees and recruits are an important target audience, do this exercise again, but from a secondary target audience perspective, from the employee one, and then make sure that you communicate a little bit differently for your prospective employees than you do for your customers. An important thing in that regard, they should still somehow fit together. You don't want to come off as being a very different company for one than the other, but it's okay to focus on different features and benefits for different audiences. Usually this is the kind of thing that is a sub message. It's a proof point, you know, in a marketing brochure that's 8 pages, it's somewhere in the fine print on page 6. On a website, it's somewhere in the About Us text. It's something that, again, you can be proud of, but you don't want to put too front and center. This is very important to be honest about this. I know a lot of companies that they think that these things belong in the upper right when really they don't. Market research is a really good area to focus on this. And then the last of the strategy starters, this is the Houston, we have a problem. So you're in the bottom right corner for a particular feature or benefit. That means that you're bad at something that is important. And when I say bad, I mean relative to your competitors. If price is really important to your audience and you're the most expensive, let's address that. That's something that's very important. If durability is something that's important to your customers and you are, yours is the most flimsy, if market specialization is very important to your audience and you're a generalist, you have to acknowledge these things. And ideally, you should do something about it if you want to actually progress. So ask yourself, is this something that we can actually improve over time? If we're worse at customer service and our audience cares about customer service, this is an area that we should invest. Sometimes as a marketing consultant, I've had to tell clients, you should actually take some of your marketing budget and not market as much this year and use that money to improve your training and your R&D because this is something that's really important and marketing and messaging is not going to fix it. You should also ask, like I mentioned earlier, is there a way that we can position this or spin it into something that's a little bit more positive? Definitely not lying. This is, you know, dishonesty will never pay off. You will always get found out for being dishonest and it will always backfire besides the fact that it's wrong. But again, that idea of like, if instead of talking about it as we're the most expensive, or rather you want to talk about it as we have the highest initial cost, but in long term, it actually saves you money. How can we phrase this in a way that can start to move it out of that risk zone? Things like this usually don't get featured in your marketing. You usually don't want to waste any space. In fact, lots of times you don't want to draw attention to this particular topic. There's one reason that, you know, Apple as a luxury brand doesn't really talk about price all that much. They don't even try to say like, well, our products last longer or you can be more productive. It's like, no, we're a luxury brand. We don't talk about price. That's not what we do. As a result, it's not usually featured prominently and proactively, but it is usually a good idea to have an answer ready in your back pocket. This is where, you know, a sales team might need some language for this in their overcoming objections part of their training. Like, if your audience brings up this should be your response. Or sometimes you have like a one-off piece, you know, a FAQ sheet that addresses things to make sure that it gets addressed somehow. Sometimes this is a barrier to getting a customer or client signed on. So again, it's enough to maybe have some talking points on it, but you don't promote it very much. But you should take a look at these things. These risk zones, this is not a fun time, a fun area to spend your time on. It's just one of those things that you need to address it. You need to play a little bit of defense. You need to think about, is this a problem with how we're communicating it, or is this actually a more intrinsic problem that we have to do something about? I want to pause for a second then and see, does anybody have any questions they'd like to throw out there that, that are related to any of these areas or these strategy starters? Okay, so if you have some, please feel free to throw them on. We're starting to head closer to the Q&A portion, and I want to make sure that I'm giving you enough to work off of. There was a question earlier on. Oh, somebody had a question of how many should we plot? That's a great question. I like to say start with about 10 or 12. The way you get to that, you could probably come up with like 30 right off the bat, but you want to pull them down to the most important ones. So going back to like the earlier exercise slide here, I've got this one right here. Just a reminder, by the way, for anyone who joined later, that you should, we're going to deliver this deck. We're going to make it available on our website afterwards if you want to reference it. You know, you might have started with 30, but then you might be like, look, it might take about an hour to plot 10 or 12 of these things. Let's at least prioritize it. Let's start with the most important 10 or 12. I think the most important thing is you do them in the approximate sequence of how important they are. That way, if you run out of time, you're running out of time on the ones that are not as important. Because as you know, the more important ones, you might spend a good 20 minutes on. Somebody else had the question of who should be involved with this. I think that a leadership team of a company, this may involve anywhere from, say, 4 or 5 people. I'd say up to like 8 to 10. Once you get to a really big group, sometimes you end up with really long conversations that are tangential. There's nothing wrong with a long, in-depth conversation as long as it stays focused. But I do like at least that 4 or 5 different people from the company, and often you may be working with a strategist. If you're if you are an EOS, you might be working with an implementer. You might be an implementer who's on this call right now, and this can guide you working with them. So, you know, a lot of times it's the leadership team plus maybe 1 or 2 other people who are helping from the outside. But what's really important is you get a variety of people, variety of different areas of expertise. You have people that are, again, people that are in the product development and R&D side or in the product delivery side of things. That's different than people that are on marketing and sales. They have different perspectives. Some may have a better bead on the target audience and what they care about. Others may have a better understanding of the actual product. Somebody asked, is it okay to get an audience insight from salespeople? Absolutely. It's just very important that it's not just what you're guessing. Lots of times, let's say you have a salesperson who's very experienced and they can draw from a lot of anecdotal evidence. That's a great starting point. When you're talking about points that work their ways to the upper right corner, you might actually build like your website and your marketing campaigns around that message. Now it's a good time to maybe vet that a little bit. Go talk to people that are in your target audience. What's even best is, like, it's great to talk to your current customers and clients. Try to talk to a couple of the ones that got away. Is there a chance for you to talk to somebody who, you know, used to use you and left, and you maybe can ask them honestly, like, hey, can we ask you why you chose not to use us anymore? Or the one that got away, you know, a possible prospective client that you just missed out on, if there's a way you can talk to them. Talking to your employees is really valuable in some ways. Just know that employees look at the world differently and look at your brand differently than your target audience and your customers. And so again, it helps sometimes to do this a second time through for employee materials and then find a way to make these things work together. Employee communications are usually more based on values, but there are sometimes very important key messages outside of values that your employees care about. So I want to just also address where do we go with this now? You know, people wonder, okay, great. So I end up with a PowerPoint slide or a wall full of Post-it notes. What do I do with this information? Now, what we're looking at here is messaging strategy. Messaging strategy is how do we communicate? What are the areas we choose to focus on? What do we prioritize? How do they fit together? Messaging strategy has no value on its own. And I'm telling you this as a messaging strategist. You can't do messaging strategy in a vacuum. It eventually has to be implemented in certain ways. It comes to life in particular key points and materials. So it's all about how you weave it into everything else that you're doing. Things like branding. Perhaps your brand is already fairly well established, or perhaps you're looking at rebranding or just fine tuning your brand. Again, if you're an EOS company, you may be revisiting your VTO and finding out, is there some language in there that we really need to tighten up? So getting it into some of that core brand language is really important. If you have brand guidelines, making sure that you work its way into that. If you have a way that you visualize your branding, and now this segues into marketing, what is the best way to visualize these things? Marketing. Many companies spend a lot of money on marketing, and you want that to be as focused and impactful as possible. So that's one area that this really, really helps. Those key messages that work their way to the upper right corner, those support messages in that blue ring, these are the things that should work their way onto your website, onto all of your materials. If you have a presence at things like trade shows, if you create videos, heading into things like if you have a strong digital presence, this helps to guide that. It makes sure that like your main message is coming through in everything that you do, not just verbally, by the way, visually as well. What's the best way we can visualize these things? Is it with photos? Is it by showing our samples of our work? Is it with infographics? Because what we do is complex. We're trying to show how simple it is, or how simple it can be. So it should be definitely implemented in all those different things. Usually, just so you know, the language that appears on that 3x3 message map is not necessarily customer-facing language yet. This is usually then, once you have that mapped out, we know what we're focused on. It's like, how do we word this in a way that is compelling? This is where you may be working with, say, a marketing or advertising agency, and they have copywriters on staff that can word things well. I can tell you, since my career started as a copywriter, people sometimes think, the writing is done because they define the main message. Not yet. You've got to write it in a way that your audience can actually connect with them. Sales enablement. So marketing and sales should usually go hand in hand, but of course they're different. Sometimes salespeople have tools that they use in their presentations, like a pitch deck, or something interactive, or some demonstration. There's always like the talk track that goes with that. What are the talking points you want to make sure that they touch on? It's great when salespeople can make it their own, but you want to make sure that there's some consistent structure around what people are saying, so that salesperson 1 is not talking about your main message, and salesperson 2 is talking about something in that upper left risk area because they just happen to be proud of that, or they just enjoy talking about that. Digital content, not just your website, but things like social media, getting an editorial calendar. This is one great area where this helps. If you're like, hey, I need to be posting more on social media and I don't know what to write about, take your main message and make sure that comes through in everything. Use those next few support points that end up in the blue and use that as kind of like, hey, once a week we're going to focus on this, once a week we're going to focus on that. And then they'll always ladder up to the main message. You can build an entire year-long editorial calendar just based on which points kind of work their way into that upper right corner and start to gravitate towards that. Your employer brand, again, it's great when your employer brand and your consumer-facing brand link up. They do not have to be one and the same. So are there things about our company that's really unique and strong that we should work our way into how we do things here? Sometimes it's like, look, this is our main message. This is what we do best at that our audience cares about. Maybe we should reward our employees more based on the ones that can deliver on that. Yes, we have to reward them based on how well they represent our values, but there's a way we can link up our messages and our values a little bit more closely. Or are there some activities we can do as a team and as a company that can kind of deliver on some of these things? Research and development, again, it's like you don't want this to just be surface level messaging fluff. I mean, honestly, that's what it would be. If it's only coming through in your communications and it doesn't at all reflect or impact the way you actually create and deliver your products and services, that's a problem. So you want to make sure, hey, you know what? We do this really well. We need to keep investing in that because that is our key to success. These are things that are close to that upper right corner. If we just invest a little bit in this, or maybe even, you know what, maybe we should cut bait on that. We don't do that well. Our audience doesn't really care. It's not making us that much money. Maybe if we do less of this and more of that, we can start to get some better customers that value us. So again, it's very important that you see this as a launching off point. That's why we call them strategy starters. Each of these things has something that if you define an area of focus and you pick an owner on your team that can run with it, there's a lot you can do with these things. Does anybody have any questions on what you do next with this information, or what you can do next with this information? All right, so we're starting to wind near to the end of the the call. But as you can imagine, you've seen things here. For many of you, this is an introduction to Bluegreen branding. We do a lot of these things. We help you develop your brand and all the core elements that go into that. If you're an EOS, we can often start with taking a look at your VTO and taking it from there. Again, we're not implementers, but we often work with implementers, people that have their business in a good place, but now need to figure out how to communicate it better, make sure that the rest of the world sees you the way that you know you are. That's what we call the gap between your business and your brand. For people that can help you follow through on things like that. So you can see a lot of that on our website. And if you have questions on that, just let us know. But also, if you like this kind of content, if you'd like to learn more about these types of things, find out about the next webinars that are coming up. Nothing planned right now, but would love to hear from you, which topics might be of interest to you. Make sure you follow us on LinkedIn. That's still our #1 way of communicating with people. Some people we also email, others we just know in our common circles, but certainly follow us on LinkedIn because you'll get more content like this. Again, just want to thank you for your time. We know that for a lot of you guys, it's a very busy day. Maybe you have to take your lunch break in order to do this. So we appreciate you joining us. I hope it was valuable to you, and please feel free to stick around, ask any questions that you like. But again, we're going to make a PDF of this available on our website fairly soon. We've also recorded this, and we need to make sure we put this in a place that's a little bit gated. So we're not sure yet if that'll be on our website or our YouTube channel. We'll keep you posted on the video. The PDF, however, should be up within a day or two. But thanks again. And yeah, we'd love to field any other questions that you have. Otherwise, thanks for joining and have a great rest of your day.